It's okay for you.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you very much for the organizers for making this event possible, and thank you for inviting me. I would have loved to have been with you in person, but as I'm sure you all know, the situation for long distance international travel is still problematic. So at least, unfortunately, this year, I will not get to visit Istanbul, a city which I'm very, very fond of. I will talk in this paper in very broad terms about logic in or the study of logic in the lands that were under Ottoman rule. There were a number of distinct traditions within the Ottoman realm, and one cannot therefore speak without any qualification of Ottoman logic or the Ottoman tradition of logic. And in the present paper, I will attempt to give a brief overview of what I see as three major sub-traditions of Arabic logic within the Ottoman realm. The first of these is the tradition in Anatolia and the Balkans, including Istanbul. This area was predominantly Turkish-speaking, though the scholarly traditions of Bosnia, Albania, and the Kurdish areas in the eastern borderlands with Iran were very similar. The standard introductory handbook in the Turkish-speaking areas of the Ottoman Empire in this period was Abhari's Isa Roji, usually studied with the commentary of Hussam ad-Din al-Kati and the more demanding commentary of Mehmet Fenari. I will try to share my screen. We should have checked for this because I don't see the possibility of sharing my screen here. I'm sorry, one minute. No. I'm very sorry. It doesn't seem as if it's going to be possible for me to share my screen and show you the PowerPoints, but I will try to proceed slowly, and hopefully this will not be a problem. Also widely studied was Katibi's Risala al-Shamsiyya with the commentary of Qutb ad-Din al-Razi and the glosses, the hawashi of later Persian scholars such as Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani, Mullah Dawood al-Harawi, Isam ad-Din al-Isfarayini, and from the 18th century, the Indo-Muslim scholar Abdul Hakim Siyalkuti. Qutb ad-Din al-Razi's commentary on Urmawi's Matali' al-Anwar was also studied, at least the early parts of that work that had been glossed by Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani. In the course of the 17th century, this was supplemented by two more advanced works. One is a treatise by the Azeri scholar Mehmet Amin Sadruddin Zadeh on what makes the numerous inquiries of logic one discipline, Jihat al-Wahda. And the other is Dawani's commentary on Taftazani's Tahdhib al-Mantiq with the glosses of Mir Abu al-Fatih Arab Shahi. In the 18th century, a number of Ottoman scholars wrote their own independent handbooks of logic. Of these, Abu Sa'id Khadimi's Ara'is Anzar al-Abkar and Ismail Galenbavi's Al-Burhan fi Ilm al-Mizan came to be widely studied and elicited a number of commentaries. The most advanced stages of the study of logic in Ottoman Turkish madrasas consisted of the in-depth exploration of metaphysical, epistemological, and semantic issues raised in the early parts of standard handbooks in the field. Fenari's commentary on Isa Roji, Qutb ad-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya, Qutb ad-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Matali', and Dawani's commentary on the Tahdhib. Interestingly, a 19th century Ottoman scholar noted that it was customary to study the second part of Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya, dealing with ascents, tasdiqat, before studying the first part, dealing with tasawurat, indicating that the part on the tasawurat was considered the more advanced part. Here are some representative Ottoman works, extensive, so long and advanced, all printed in the 19th century, include, for example, Qara Khalil Tirawi's Hashia on the commentary of Fanari on Isagoji, which was printed on numerous occasions in Istanbul in the 19th century. Around 2/3 of that work is devoted to introductory matters and tasawurat. We also have the work by Abdullah Chankiri, Hashia on the commentary of Fanari on Isagoji, which was printed on several occasions also in the 19th century in Istanbul. And here around 72% is devoted to the discussion of introductory matters and conceptions, tasawurat. Ismail Galanbawi's Hashia on the Hashia of Mir Abul Fatih on the early parts of Dawani's commentary on Tahdhib al-Mantiq. This was printed twice. It only covers the Muqaddimah of Tahdhib al-Mantiq, so the introduction of Tahdhib al-Mantiq. I can also mention printings in the 19th century of Muftizadeh Mehmet Sadiq Erzinjani's Hashia on Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya. So this was printed in 2 volumes, 1 volume on Tasawurat and 1 volume on Tasdiqat. And if we look at this work as a whole, around 60% is devoted to introductory matters and tasawurat, and only around 13% that deal with ahkam al-qadaya, such as conversion, contraposition, the immediate implications of conditionals, and the formal syllogism. And the last work I'll mention here, which was also printed in the 19th century and a very extensive work, is by Khoja Karim Amasi. And this was a Hashia on the Hashia of Siyalkuti on the part on Tasawurat from Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya. This was lithographed in 2 volumes in Istanbul in the 1880s. A number of Ottoman scholars, such as Qara Khalil Tirawi, who I've just mentioned, who died in 1123 or 1711, gained a reputation as eminent logicians without engaging in any sustained manner with the formal aspects of modal logic or hypothetical logic. Qara Khalil's major works on logic include the gloss on Fanari's commentary on Abhari's Isagoji that I've just mentioned. He wrote also a Hashia on the Risala of Mehmet Amin Sadruddin Zadeh on Jihat al-Wahda, which I've just mentioned. He wrote a Hashia on Mir Abul Fatih's Hashia on Dawani's commentary on Tahdhib al-Mantiq. So again, focusing exclusively on the very early parts of the Tahdhib al-Mantiq. And he wrote a very extensive Hashia on the Hashia of Mullah Dawood al-Harawi, again on the first half on the Tasawurat of Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya. Now, to be sure, there were still Ottoman scholars such as Khadimi and Galanbawi who in their writings showed that they had studied carefully the modal and hypothetical logic of the classic 13th century handbooks of Urmawi and Katibi. But even in their case, this was an area of logic that was apparently considered to have been worked out in detail by previous authorities, with little room for original departures or controversy. The sections of Khadimi's Ara'is and Galanbawi's Burhan that deal with the conversion and contraposition of modal propositions and with modal and hypothetical syllogisms are not noticeably original, though other parts of the 2 handbooks certainly are original, and I've argued for that in some previous publications, that we should take these works seriously, but it's not the section on the muwajjahat and their ahkam or the qiyasat iqtiraniya shartiya that are the places where one immediately sees a lot of originality. Now, some of you present might be thinking, what about Galembevi's treatise on the modalities, his Miftah Bab al-Muwajjahat? This is certainly an original and sophisticated work, but it is primarily a philosophical exploration of modal concepts of darura and dawam and itlaq, and it has very little to say about the formal properties of modality propositions, i.e. their conversions, their contrapositions, or their relative strength, the nisab between them. One may contrast Galembevi's work with another work by his Egyptian contemporary Ahmed al-Mallawi, Al-La'ali al-Manshurat ala Nazm al-Muwajjahat, which is almost entirely dedicated to such formal questions, such as the nisab, the uqus, the aks naqid, and has almost nothing to say about the metaphysical questions pursued in Galembevi's work. Another feature of the Ottoman Turkish tradition is the intense interest in adab al-bahth. The kind of dialectic represented by the works of Shamsuddin al-Samarkandi, who died in 1322. The sheer volume of Ottoman Turkish contributions to this field is conspicuous and unrivaled anywhere else in the Islamic world. A standard introduction to the field was a short handbook by the 16th century scholar Tashköprüzade. This would standardly be followed by a study of Samarkandi's handbook with the commentary of Mas'ud Shirwani and various Hawashi glosses on that work, on that commentary. From around the middle of the 17th century, students would typically also study the commentary by Mullah Mahmud Hanafi, who was flourished in Herat and later Bukhara in the early decades of the 16th century, on a short treatise by Aduddin al-Iji, and usually the commentary was studied with the gloss of Mir Abul Fatih. This came to be supplemented with new works in the field written by Ottoman scholars, such as the Risala by Hussein Adanawi, the treatise came to be known as the Risala al-Husayniyya. Adanawi flourished probably around the year 1680, so late 17th century. And the works of Mehmed Sajjakli Zadeh, who died in 1732. And the background that you see is a early printing of one of his works on Adab al-Bahth, Taqrir al-Qawanin al-Mutadawala fi Ilm al-Munazara. One consequence of this intense cultivation of Adab al-Bahth was a renewed interest in casting scholarly arguments into explicit syllogistic form to make clear which premises might be contested in a disputation. This concern with syllogistic regimentation led to an interest in so-called unfamiliar syllogisms, i.e. formally valid relational inferences that had not been recognized in classical Aristotelian logic. For example, in one of the works of Sajjakli Zadeh that I've just mentioned, a dialectical objection to a definition is cast in the form of the following syllogism. This definition leads to circularity. Circularity is absurd, so this definition leads to the absurd. This so-called unfamiliar syllogism, qiyas ghair muta'araf, is in effect a relational syllogism. Though intuitively valid, such arguments were not recognized in classical Aristotelian logic. Beginning with Fakhruddin al-Razi in the 12th century, some Arabic logicians had proposed that such inferences were productive without the need for analyzing them into standard Aristotelian syllogisms with three terms. The topic had elicited controversy in the wide-ranging debates between the 15th century Persian philosophers Dawani, Jalaluddin Dawani, and Sadruddin Dashtaki. Dawani had argued against Dashtaki that an inference such as the following was productive as it stood without the need for rewriting it into the form of a standard Aristotelian syllogism. Dawani's example is Zayd is the brother of Amr, Amr is the leader of the town, so Zayd is the brother of the leader of the town. Dawani's point was repeated by some of his later followers and glossators, but until the 18th century, the point had simply been reiterated in certain ad hoc contexts, leaving little influence on overall presentations of syllogisms in handbooks of logic. The fact that unfamiliar syllogisms came to be employed by Ottoman dialecticians in their attempt to regiment arguments into syllogistic form brought the concept of qiyas ghair muta'araf to the forefront and led to further developments of the basic idea formulated by Dawani. Most importantly, perhaps, the idea emerged in the early decades of the 18th century that unfamiliar syllogisms can occur in all four syllogistic figures and that these have conditions of productivity that may or may not be similar to those of standard syllogisms. An influential and early expression of this insight is to be found in a short treatise on Qiyas Ghair Muta'araf by Musa Pahlivani, who was active in Toqat in north-central Anatolia in the early decades of the 18th century. Though some Safavid and Mughal logicians were aware of Dawani's points, the Iranian and Indo-Muslim traditions did not develop a fixed concept of Qiyas Ghair Muta'araf or divide them into figures or moods. But I will add that the logic of unfamiliar syllogisms seems not to have been fully worked out by Ottoman logicians. So Gelenbevi incorporated a brief discussion of such syllogisms in his Burhan and urged that the matter be studied carefully, but neither he nor his later commentators devoted careful attention to working out the conditions of productivity across all figures and moods. Instead, 19th century Ottoman logicians used unfamiliar syllogisms as a tool to help them cast the wording of logic handbooks into chains of formal syllogism. This approach came to be known as the New Principles, Al-Usul Al-Jadida, and its foremost representative was Khojazadeh Abdallah Killisi, who died in 1886. He's supposedly taught in Aleppo, and wrote two celebrated glosses on Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya, one on the Tasdiqat and one on the Tasawurat. And these works are very different from earlier glosses. So Killisi just systematically tries to cast the prose of Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi into a series of syllogisms, and he makes extensive use of the Qiyas Ghair Muta'araf in doing so. Given the geographic proximity to Europe, the Ottomans were amongst the earliest in the Islamic world to encounter the early modern Latin tradition of logic. During the reigns of Mehmed IV and Ahmed III, there was some interest in European learning at the Ottoman court, and a number of scholars in Istanbul made translations of, for example, the Atlas Minor of Hondius, the Atlas Major of Blau, and the works of the Paracelsian physicians and alchemists Crolius and Sennert. The Ottoman scholar Esad Yanyavi also translated a work on logic by the Greek-born, Padua-based Aristotelian Ioannis Cottonius, and dedicated the translation to Ahmed III. Of course, in the course of the 19th century, the influence of Western logic grew. So, for example, the volume on logic from Elementi di Filosofia by the Italian philosopher Pasquale Galuppi was translated into Turkish and published in Istanbul in 1861 with the title Miftah al-Funun. The Turkish scholar Ali Sedad wrote a seminal work, Mizan al-Uqul fil Mantiq wal-Usul, which introduced readers to the new logical ideas of the 19th century English logicians, Hamilton, De Morgan, Boole, and Jevons. An even more enthusiastic endorsement of the new algebra of logic was made a generation later by Saleh Zeki in his Mizani Tefekkur, published in 1913, 1 year before the outbreak of World War I. Now I turn now to the second of the three major subdivisions that I want to cover in this paper. The second is the North African tradition of Arabic logic. This tradition goes back to at least the 14th century. It was broadly post-Avicennan, but retained a distinct regional character. So most obviously, the handbooks used, this would be Akhdari's introductory As-Sullam al-Murawnak, Sanusi's intermediate Mukhtasar al-Mantiq, and Khunaji's advanced Al-Jumal fil Mantiq, were not commonly studied in the Turco-Persianate world. The famous bibliographer Katib Chalabi, writing in the early 17th century, for example, seems to have been unaware of Sanusi's Mukhtasar, and he was confused about Akhdari's Sullam and Khunaji's Jumal, so falsely stating that Akhdari's Sullam was a versification of Abhari's Isa Ghoji, and falsely also saying that the Khunashi's Jumal was an epitome of a work called Nihayat al-Amal. Actually, Nihayat al-Amal is a commentary on the Jumal. So clearly showing that Katib Chalabi, who's of course a major source, and we are all indebted to his work, but he was not very familiar with North African works on logic. Conversely, there appears to have been little awareness in the Maghrib, at least until the second half of the 18th century, of the Eastern logical tradition after Sa'd ad-Din al-Taftazani in the 14th century. They appear, for example, to have been unfamiliar with the works of Jalal ad-Din al-Dawani that were so influential throughout the Turco-Persianate world. The turn towards intense discussion of introductory matters and conceptions that is so characteristic of Eastern Islamic logic after the 14th century is also much less marked among North African logicians. This can be brought out by comparing the emphasis of a Moroccan gloss on Sanusi's commentary on the Mukhtasar with that of an Eastern gloss from the same time and of comparable length on Qutb ad-Din al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya. So we can, if we look at Al-Hasan al-Yusi, a Moroccan scholar from the 17th century, he wrote Hashiyya on the Sharh Mukhtasar al-Mantiq of Sanusi. And on the other hand, we have Abd al-Hakim Siyalkuti, a 17th century Indo-Muslim scholar who writes a Hashiyya of comparable length on Sharh al-Shamsiyya. The comparison of the content is quite interesting. So around 1/3 of Yusi's gloss is devoted to introductory matters and to tasawwurat, whereas in Siyalkuti's case, 60%, so almost double, is devoted to the introductory matters and tasawwurat. And if we look at the discussion of the conversion, contraposition, the immediate implications of conditionals, and the formal syllogistic, including the modal syllogisms, Yusi devoted around 40% of his Hashiyya on those topics, whereas Siyalkuti only devoted something like 13% of his Hashiyya to such topics. And Siyalkuti is quite typical of the Eastern tradition by this time, and Yusi is quite typical of the Maghribi tradition in this time. The upshot is that in the Maghrib, the discipline of logic was still closely associated with the study of formal implications and with constructing and evaluating formal proofs. North African logicians still showed an interest in the topic of the immediate implications, the lawazim of conditionals and disjunctions, shartiyat. Even until the end of the 18th century. Now, none of the major Eastern handbooks on logic from the 14th century to the 18th devote much attention to this topic. It is also striking that the discipline of Adab al-Bahth, as it crystallized in the works of Shams ad-Din al-Samarqandi, does not seem to have been much studied west of Egypt. Strikingly, there appears to be no substantial contribution to the literature on Adab al-Bahth by a scholar from the Maghrib up to the 19th century. It is also indicative that the 17th century Moroccan scholar Al-Hasan al-Yusi, whom I've just mentioned, who was a logician and an apologist for the rational sciences in general, did not mention Adab al-Bahth or Ilm al-Munadara in his Encyclopedia of the Sciences, Al-Qanun. Why the Maghrib did not adopt the discipline for so long is not clear to me. The influence of the Maghribi tradition of logic was also felt in Egypt and is in evidence in the writings of the Egyptian logician Ahmed al-Mallawi, whose work on modal propositions was mentioned earlier in my talk and contrasted with Gelenbevi's work on the modalities. A list of his works shows the distinct regional character of North African logic, both in the kinds of handbooks studied and in the emphasis on the formal aspect of the logic of modalities and of conditionals and disjunctions. So he wrote a long commentary on As-Sullam al-Murrawnak, a short commentary on As-Sullam, and then he wrote Al-La'ali al-Manthurat ala Nazm al-Muwajjahat, which is a commentary on his own didactic poem on the modal propositions and their conversions and contrapositions. He wrote Al-Asrar al-Ma'qulat fi Sharh Nazm al-Mukhtalitat, which is his commentary on his own didactic poem on modal syllogisms. He wrote a didactic poem on the Lawazim al-Shartiyat, again with his own commentary. He wrote a didactic poem with a commentary on the difference between khariji and haqiqi propositions, so propositions where the subject is assumed to exist, or if it's just supposed to exist. He wrote a treatise called تحفة المشتاق ببيان انحصار الكيفية إما في الضرورة وما يقابلها وإما في الدوام والإطلاق, showing that all modality propositions are encompassed by necessity and its negation and perpetuity and its negation. A didactic poem called لطائف with a commentary, لطائف المعاني في النسب بين أحد المنتسبين ونقيض الثاني. He also wrote a treatise on the logical relations between modality propositions, المنح الوافيات في نسب الموجهات. So these are some of his major works on logic, clearly showing his interest in the formal properties of modal propositions and of conditionals and disjunctions. Now, from the middle of the 18th century, there's evidence of an increased influence of the Eastern Islamic logical tradition in North Africa. So by then, Taftazani's Tahdhib al-Mantiq, with the commentary of the Central Asian scholar Ubaidullah Khabisi, was being taught in Tunis. At the same time, the works of the Indo-Muslim scholar Abdul Hakim Siyalkuti became familiar to Egyptian scholars. So Ahmad al-Mallawi, who dies in 1767, had not engaged with Siyalkuti's work when writing in the early decades of the 18th century, but his student Ali al-Adawi al-Sa'idi plagiarized extensively from Siyalkuti's work in his own gloss on Qutbuddin al-Razi's commentary on the Shamsiyya. And a generation later, the Egyptian scholar Hassan al-Attar became familiar with some of the later Indo-Muslim works on logic, such as Mir Zahid Harawi's gloss on Dawani's commentary on Tahdhib al-Mantiq, and Bihari's Sullam al-Ulum with some of its commentaries. Appealing to such works, he urged his Egyptian colleagues to revise what he deemed their complacent belief in the superiority of their own scholarship. Attar's own logical writings quote profusely from later Persian and Indo-Muslim works. The third and last major subdivision of Arabic logic in the Ottoman realm that I will discuss is the one among the Christian Arabs of the Levant. The 17th century witnessed the beginning of a literary and cultural efflorescence among Arabic-speaking Christians in the Levant, though it would with time gain a momentum of its own and affect Levantine Christians of all denominations, as well as Arab Muslims. The movement was originally linked to the proselytizing and educational efforts of counter-Reformation Catholicism. A Maronite college was founded in Rome in 1584. Its students were trained in a range of disciplines, including Latin, Arabic, Syriac, logic, philosophy, and theology, and many returned to assume influential clerical and educational positions at home. Another Maronite college was founded in Aleppo in 1666, and its cultural and intellectual role was hardly less significant. Another important educational institution in Rome that attracted Levantine Christians was the Pontifical Urban College for the Propagation of the Faith, founded in 1622. Some aspects of this cultural and literary movement are familiar to modern historians, especially the spread of printing in the 18th century in Levantine Christian circles and the emergence of accomplished Christian Arab belletrists and grammarians have often been seen as precursors of the so-called Nahda, the self-styled renaissance of Arabic letters in the 19th century. Less attention has been given to the emergence of an Arabic tradition of philosophy and logic among Maronite and Greek Catholic scholars in the 17th and 18th centuries. Though written in Arabic, Christian Arabic works on logic from the 17th and 18th centuries are noticeably distinct from the post-Avicennan tradition prevalent among their Muslim contemporaries and much closer to the early modern Latin tradition of logic in Catholic Europe. I will illustrate this by looking at the work of Butrus al-Tulawi, who was born in what is today Lebanon, studied in Rome, and later taught in Aleppo. He wrote two works on logic, an introductory Al-Madkhal or Isa Ghoji, completed in 1688, and a longer Kitab al-Mantiq, completed in 1693. These were conceived as the first two parts of a four-part survey of philosophy, and they were followed by a volume on natural philosophy and a volume on metaphysics. The works were written while Tulawi was teaching in Aleppo and were presumably taught to his students. The numerous extant manuscripts from the 18th and 19th centuries attest to their popularity. Tulawi's Isaroji is very much in the 17th century Latin scholastic tradition of logic. The basic organizing principle was to devote three main parts of the work to each of the three operations of the mind, أفعال القوة العقلية. Simple conception, تصور بسيط, judgment, حكم, and ratiocination, or nazar. His discussion of terms includes elements that were standard in the Latin tradition but foreign to the Arabic Islamic tradition. For example, he distinguished between categorimatic, muhassal, and syntax categorimatic, غير muhassal terms. He also outlined the Latin theory of supposition, which he calls fard or niyaba, and discussed the ampliation, fasaha, and restriction, hasr, of terms. In the part on assent, some of the conspicuously Latin elements are the recognition of four kinds of compound proposition: the conditional, the disjunction, which would have been known in the Arabic Islamic tradition, but then also the conjunction, the qadiyya atfiyya, and the causal proposition, the qadiyya sababiyya. And these last two types were not explicitly recognized in the post-Avicennan Arabic Islamic tradition. Tulawi also recognized what he called exponable propositions, al-qadiyya al-wajib tafsiruha. He only recognized three modalities: necessity, impossibility, and contingency, by contrast to the more than dozen modality propositions recognized in post-Avicennan logic. In the part on ratiocination, some of the more distinctive features are the following. So like medieval and early modern Latin logicians, Tulawi gave the major premise in a syllogism, the kubra, first, whereas the Arabic Islamic tradition from its beginning tended to give the minor premise first. Tulawi referred to syllogisms in which the minor premise is given first as qiyasat al-Arab, the syllogisms of the Arabs. He recognized only three figures of the syllogism rather than the four that were standard among Muslim logicians after the 13th century. The five valid moods of the first figure were instead given as indirect moods, so durub غير مستقيمة of the first figure. Tulawi did not quantify conditionals and disjunctions as post-Avicennan logicians did, nor did he discuss the wholly hypothetical syllogism, the qiyas iqtirani sharti. Like most Latin logicians of the medieval and early modern periods, he included a discussion of expository syllogisms, al-qiyas al-wajib tafsiruhu, i.e. syllogisms in which the middle term is a particular, not a universal, such as this man is walking, Zayd is this man, so Zayd is walking. Towards the end of his work, Tulawi briefly expounded some of the basic rules of consequence, sometimes found in early modern Latin introductions to logic. So the principles he gives are: one, a true antecedent only produces a true consequent. A false consequent only follows from a false antecedent. False antecedents may produce false or true consequence. If the antecedent is necessary, then the consequent is necessary. If the antecedent is possible, then the consequent is possible. If the consequent is impossible, then the antecedent is impossible. If the consequent is false, then the antecedent is false. The contradictory of the consequent produces the contradictory of the antecedent. And everything that follows from the consequent also follows from the antecedent. So these are the 9 principles he puts forth. Tulawi appears to have been familiar with some works belonging to the Arabic Islamic tradition. The Isaroji of Al-Abhari had been printed in Rome in 1625 in Arabic, along with a Latin translation by the Italian Franciscan Tommaso Ubezzino da Navarra. Even though Tulawi may have had to coin Arabic terms to render concepts such as supposition, ampliation, and reduplicative, his work displays a conspicuous terminological continuity with Muslim works on logic when dealing with concepts shared between the two traditions, such as proposition, syllogism, mood, figure, and modality. On a few occasions, Tulawi appears to have introduced elements from the Arabic Islamic tradition into his work. For example, he distinguished between signification by correspondence, mutabaqa by inclusion, tadammun, and by implication, iltizam, a standard feature in Islamic works on logic, such as Abhari's Isagoji, but not of Latin introductions to the field. So let me conclude. In this paper, I've spoken in broad terms, trying to capture some of the distinctive features of sub-traditions of Arabic logic within the Ottoman realm. There is, of course, always a risk involved in adopting a broad panoramic view. Certain generalizations may be challenged and modified by future research on particular works or figures. The history of logic in Islamic civilization is still a young field in which major discoveries may still be made. It's heartening to see a new generation of researchers from Turkey and beyond beginning to study the rich scholarly legacy of the region, not just in logic, but also in adjacent fields such as dialectics, philosophy, and rhetoric. It is only proper that most of this research be piecemeal and focused on particular issues, works, or scholars. Without such focused and detailed research, any general picture we have of the tradition will be inaccurate. But at the same time, more focused and detailed research is disjointed and inconclusive unless we have a sense of the overall picture within which these details fit. An assumption that was very influential until very recently was that Islamic civilization as such declined after the Mongols in the 13th century. Another influential assumption was that the Ottomans enjoyed their heyday in the 15th and 16th centuries, and that especially the study of the rational sciences declined after the reign of Suleiman. I think we know enough already to confidently reject such assumptions. But I don't think we can dispense with overarching narratives as such. And I've suggested that any narrative that we have will have to take into account the multiplicity of scholarly traditions in the Islamic world and within the Ottoman world. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for the problems with sharing PowerPoint.
Dr. Ruhaib, thank you very much for this insightful conference. I think we're going to move on to Q&A session now for 15 minutes. And see if the audience have any questions. So we have one, two, okay. Can we give the microphone to the gentleman over here? Şuradaki beyefendi, mikrofon. Mikrofon. Sorunuzu sorar mısınız? Ben burada okurum. Can you ask your question so I can read? Huh?
Hello, Dr. Al-Ruhaib. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Thank you. We are very much indebted to your scholarship. We had to read your book about 4 years ago at one of the Adab Merkazi intensive programs. One of our students, Nimet Jabaji, is one of your PhD students. Another familiar name is Abdurrahman Mehrig. We have a lot of people that know you and have benefited from you, thankfully.
Thank you.
I have a question which may sound a little, it would require a bit of theorizing. So I spent quite a bit of time in the Maghrib, and I was shocked at how little there was in terms of attention to the study of logic. One of the ulama that were there, they had studied the Hashit al-Bannani, I think on the Sulam. And alhamdulillah, that was beneficial, but it seemed for whatever reason that once I visited Turkey, it was nothing at all comparable to what was going on in the Ottoman central lands. And it seems from what you're saying that it was there was a rather long period of being cut off from what was going on in the eastern parts of the Muslim world. You said why that happened is not clear to me, but could you possibly theorize as to some potential reasons why great scholars like Hassan Nussi, for example, and others, were not, for example, familiar, even though they were very well known in other, perhaps, areas? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very tough question, and I don't have a clear answer. It seems that it seems that the problem, it seems to me that the problem is slightly more general. So it seems that there was so much confidence in one's own regional tradition that in certain situations where one might have expected some conversation across traditions, that it didn't happen. We know that Hassan al-Yusi went on the Hajj. He came back reportedly saying there is no scholar in the East that's worth traveling to visit. Now, maybe that's an over-hasty, if that's correct, the attribution is correct, maybe an over-hasty remark to make. But I've even come across cases of Anatolian scholars spending time in Egypt. So Davud Qarsi in the 18th century, writing works on logic, which clearly show that he has not looked at any of the Maghribi works, even though they were studied in Egypt in his time. And we know he was in Cairo, he wrote works in Cairo. We know that these, so Akhdari Sullam or Sanusi's Mukhtasar were studied in Cairo in his time, but he is still very much in his own tradition. He's engaging with the commentary traditions on the Shamsiyya and the Tahdhib, and not with what, so to some extent, maybe there is a regional ethnic dimension, sort of identity that is involved. I would also say that so if one reads Zabidi in the second half of the 18th century, he's in Cairo, and he in fact writes, and this is what I read sort of many years ago and led me to explore some of the Maghribi traditions of logic. He writes, he says that the Maghribis are the leaders in the field of logic in Cairo in his time. And he said, yusharu ilayhim, as masters of the field, right? So clearly something has happened, say, between the time of Zabidi and maybe in the early 20th century. And there seems to have been a very precipitous decline in the Maghrib in interests in the rational sciences over the course, sort of say, from the late 18th to the early 20th century. To such an extent that I think even the memory of just how vibrant the field was in the 17th and early 18th century has been lost in North Africa. And many North African intellectuals now sort of hark back to a much earlier time, the time of Ibn Rushd and things like that, but they seem not to have been aware. There seems to have been a gap in the historical memory, which may change. I mean, I think even in some Turkish scholarship, maybe of a generation ago, there was also maybe the kind of not sufficient awareness of the richness of the Ottoman tradition and of people like Khadimi and Gelenbevi. I mean, you could find Ottomanists in the 60s and 70s sort of more or less suggesting that there's nothing in the Ottoman tradition except Shuruh and Hawashi, and it was not worth looking at. So maybe things will change in the Maghrib as well. I hope so. I know I haven't answered your question, why these very strict regional traditions seem to, but I mean, if we compare India, for example, they also have their own very strict, strictly regional tradition. They don't seem to be particularly aware of people like Gelenbevi. Gelenbevi himself doesn't seem to be aware of Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra in Iran. So I don't think it's just the Maghribis who are not sort of open-minded enough. I think it's a more general phenomenon. But thank you. This is, I think I'm happy to think further. I mean, this is just off the cuff. I'm happy to think further on this topic along with you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruhaib. Any other question? So we have a question from Dr. Jung.
Hi, Khalid.
Hello.
Thanks for your talk again. As it's always wonderful to see you and to learn from you. You've shown us that deeply analytical Adab al-Bath works like Al-Adanavi spurred new investigations in logic. And you know, of course, Shahid Rahman in Lille, and there's a kind of hot topic with him is the dialectical constitution of meaning. And if I understand correctly, more generally, the formative role of dialectic or dialogical logic with regard to logic in providing motives and reasons for advances or developments in logic, going all the way back to Aristotle. So my question is, in your experience with so many works from both the Adab al-Bath and the Mantiq traditions, do more examples come to mind of dialectic spurring advances in logic, like Al-Adanavi and unfamiliar syllogisms? Does anything else come to mind?
I mean, a very closely related thing would be the emergence in sort of 19th century Ottoman works, the Usul Jadida tradition. There's suddenly sort of pops up the concept of the Chifti Sughraly, the syllogism with a double minor. This seems to come out of the blue. I suspect very strongly that this also has roots in the dialectical tradition, because if one looks at the works of Sarjaqzadeh, you can find analysis of arguments saying, well, this argument actually, you analyze it into two minor premises, or that the minor premises are actually two statements. Other examples, I haven't looked either. So the fact that I haven't come across other examples doesn't mean that they're not there. But as I think you know, I've also tried to argue that the reflections on Adab al-Mutala'a, on the proprieties of reading that emerge in the 17th century in the Ottoman Empire with Ahmed Munajjim Bashi's sort of major work on this, also seems to have been spurred to a large extent by interest in Adab al-Bath. But I mean, yeah, I think there's plenty of research to do, and I agree wholeheartedly with you that the emergence of dialectics in later centuries seems to have been a spur to a lot of new thinking in adjacent fields, and it's something that should be studied.
Well, thank you very much. Do you have any further questions? Any other questions? We've got one more question from the audience, and also we only have time for another question.
Hi, Mr. Rahib. I am Ahmed Kaj from Turkey. 2 years ago, I was in Princeton, and I am in Pittsburgh. I met Mr. Richard there, and I made a study about his contribution to Arabic logic. But I was to ask a question about history of logic in general in Islamic world. As we know, Richard wrote a book in the 60s. I mean, and then you write also some things on them, and Tony Street did some things. Is there can be a compassing all the sides of the logic, the people and the works together. Is there any idea or any proposal for this subject to write a compassing logic, history of logic in Islamic world? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think, so I tried to do a very partial thing like this in my last book, The Development of Arabic Logic, but of course it's only from 1200 to 1800. I think it would be wonderful if there was some kind of edited volume on the history of Arabic logic from the beginning. It would probably require a team of scholars to do. One thing that I think is very exciting is the project that's coming out of Zurich, which is the Überweg project, which is supposed to be, so I think we have already several volumes coming out that have already come out and several volumes that are coming out soon. And this will be 4 or 5 or 6 volumes, which are sort of a biobibliographic and thematic overview of Islamic philosophy from the beginning to the end, to the modern period. This will include logic, but it's not entirely devoted to logic. So one can find a lot of information on logicians in those volumes, but it's not exclusively devoted to logic. Yeah, so, but no, it would be really good to have a unified volume. It would probably require it's kind of a concerted effort of a team of scholars. That's my sense.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ruhaib. If you have any concluding remarks, please do add them in concluding remarks or comments on the topic. If not,
thank you again for your patience with this format of Zoom. And again, my apologies, the screen sharing thing did not work. Again, to repeat, I find it very heartening that there is this wave of interest in the region in rediscovering the history of logic in the Ottoman period, and I think it's a wonderful thing. And I'm sure that there are many scholars in the room that I can see here in front of me who will push the frontiers of research forward and will probably also qualify or modify or correct some of the things that I have said in my talk. So good luck with your further research, and thank you again for your kind invitation to me. And I'm sorry I could not have been present in person, but as we say in Arabic, تجري الرياح بما لا تشتهي السفن, to quote the poet Al-Mutanabbi. Thank you so much.
thank you very much, Dr. Ruhaib.